Sometimes a woman reaches a moment when pretending no longer works. When loneliness presses so hard it can't be hidden by fine dresses, full rooms, or money enough to buy silence. Sometimes that same woman gathers the nerve to cross a stretch of dust and noise and speak the most honest words of her life to a stranger. In the fall of 1889, Lila Crow did exactly that when she stepped up to a broad-shouldered cowboy named Cole Rourke and made an offer that stopped every nearby conversation cold. She had wealth, polish, and a life planned down to the last detail. He had calloused hands, little to his name, and every quality her family warned her to fear. When she spoke of wanting strong sons, his reply did not sound like greed or surprise. It sounded like a man who saw past silk and reputation and straight into the hollow places of her heart. That September morning began quietly, like any other. Inside the great Crow house overlooking Larkspur Junction, Lila stood at her bedroom window, watching pale steam rise from coffee cups and cook fires in the railroad town below. Wagons creaked, hammers rang, and the day took shape one ordinary sound at a time. At 28, she owned everything a woman of the era was expected to want: land, money, an education sharper than most men's, and a beauty that turned heads from church steps to cattle pens. Still, her fingers worried the wedding ring that had once belonged to her mother, a habit formed in the 5 years since Maeve Crow had died. The small diamond caught the morning light, plain and honest. Nothing like the heavy jewelry her father now insisted she wear in public. The emptiness inside her felt as wide as the Montana sky beyond the mountains. That ring came from a time when love mattered more than position, when her parents had built a life with their own hands instead of inheriting power already forged. Now it reminded her daily of what she had never known: a partnership born of affection rather than calculation. "Miss Lila, your father would like to see you in the study." The voice belonged to Rosa Vale, the housekeeper who had helped raise her after her mother's death. Rosa balanced a breakfast tray in steady hands, her dark eyes heavy with the same worry she had worn for weeks. At 60, Rosa carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had watched the Crow family navigate wealth, ambition, and expectation for decades. Lila turned from the window, smoothing her deep blue silk dress. "Another suitor, I assume?" "Clayton Baird from Denver. My father mentioned railroad investments and expansion." Rosa set the tray on the vanity, her tone carefully even. Disapproval lived in the smallest shifts of her voice. The name Baird made Lila's stomach tighten. She had met Clayton twice, a lean, calculating man in his 40s who spoke of women as though they were stock to be measured and traded. One wife dead in childbirth, another taken by pneumonia, and whispers that he was already searching for the next replacement. The thought of enduring another breakfast while he discussed breeding potential and profit margins made Lila long to ride straight into the open land and never look back. "Tell me the truth, Rosa," Lila said, lifting her hair to pin it back. "Do you think my mother would have chosen differently if she'd known what her daughter's life would become?" Rosa moved through the room, straightening what needed no straightening. "Your mother chose love, Nina. She once told me she'd rather live in a cabin with a man who saw her soul than in a palace with one who only saw her face." Rosa's words lingered in the air, sharp as a blade, because they named exactly what Lila Crow had been denied. Every man who sought her hand saw the Crow name first: the mines, the money, the influence that came with it. None of them looked past that. To them, she was breeding stock for legacy and a polished symbol of ambition. Not one had ever asked what she read by lamplight, what lands she dreamed of seeing beyond the territories, or how she longed to turn the family fortune toward something that mattered more than endless accumulation. Warren Crow's study reflected the man himself, Grand, costly, and meant to overpower, one wall was buried beneath maps of mining claims, their borders inked and re-inked with ruthless precision. Ledgers filled custom shelves, each page tracking the steady expansion of the Crow Empire. Behind a massive oak desk sat a man who had clawed his way from the son of an Irish immigrant to one of Montana's most formidable powers. At 55, Warren still carried the broad shoulders and hardened hands of his prospecting years, though his suits now came from the finest tailors in San Francisco. "Lila, my dear, come in," he said, motioning to the leather chair across from him. Another man already occupied its twin. Clayton Baird rose smoothly, offering a practiced smile, his pale eyes measuring her the way a rancher sized up livestock. "Miss Crow, you're radiant this morning," Clayton said, his voice polished and false warm, the tone of a man used to getting his way, by charm when possible, by pressure when not. Lila allowed him to brush a kiss over her gloved hand, noting how his grip lingered a second too long, how his smile never reached his eyes, how he angled himself to narrow her path to the door. Every movement was calculated, predatory. "Clayton has been telling me about his expansion plans for the Denver and Rio Grande line," Warren said, leaning back with the satisfaction of a man arranging a profitable exchange. "The partnership possibilities are impressive." For the next hour, Lila sat in careful silence while the two men discussed her future as if she were a parcel to be transferred. Clayton spoke of merging railroad and mining interests, of the standing she would enjoy in Denver society, of the fine, strong children such a union would produce. Warren listened with approval, casting occasional glances her way to ensure she looked agreeable. When Clayton finally left, promising to continue their courtship at the upcoming county fair, Lila remained seated, her gaze fixed on the map that marked her father's life's work. "He's a good man, Lila," Warren said, mistaking her stillness for reflection. "Established, connected, able to give you everything you deserve." "Everything but affection," she replied softly. Warren's jaw tightened. "Affection is a luxury. Security and respect are necessities. Your mother understood that." "My mother married for love," Lila said, her fingers brushing the wedding ring hidden beneath her glove. "She married a poor prospector with nothing but hope and grit. I became successful enough to give her comfort," Warren countered. "Love alone doesn't put food on the table or protect a family's future." The discussion ended there, as it always did, his practical certainty crushing her quiet resistance like ore beneath a stamp mill. Lila excused herself and drifted through the mansion's lavish halls, feeling like a visitor in a life that no longer felt like her own. That afternoon, she saddled her mare and rode through Larkspur Junction, past the shops, the rail yards, the people her family's wealth had shaped, watching a town built by ambition and wondering where she fit inside it. The railroad fed the town without rest, pouring in prospectors, traders, and families, each chasing a private version of the American promise. Main Street throbbed with life. The general store crowded with voices, the bank where Warren Crow's influence ran deep, the hotel where visiting businessmen cut deals that would redraw the territory's future. At the edge of town, Lila Crow reined in near the construction site, where men were raising the grandstand for the county fair. In 3 days, the region would gather to mark the harvest's end and the long Montana winter's approach. There would be contests and dancing, and the familiar procession of eligible men hoping to earn either her interest or her father's approval. Watching the workers, men with honest calluses earned through real labor, Lila felt a sharp, sudden ache for something true. She wanted to matter for reasons that had nothing to do with ledgers or land deeds. She wanted to build something with her own hands, not simply inherit a finished empire. More than anything, she wanted to feel alive in a way untouched by obligation or expectation. The fair would draw people from ranches and homesteads spread across hundreds of miles. Men who had never whispered her name, who would not measure her worth in mining claims or railroad shares. Maybe, among that crowd, someone might see past silk and polish to the woman beneath. As the sun dropped behind the mountains, staining the sky with gold and crimson, Lila made a choice that would have stunned her father and scandalized Denver society. She would go to the fair not as a dutiful daughter seeking an acceptable match, but as a woman determined to find something real, even if it meant abandoning everything she had been taught about her place in the world. The wedding ring warmed against her finger as if Maeve Crow's spirit approved. For the first time in years, anticipation stirred where dread had lived. She could not know that in 3 days she would cross a stretch of dust and speak words that would echo through Larkspur Junction for generations. Nor could she imagine that her search would lead her to a quiet giant of a man, whose answer would reshape not only her life, but her understanding of love, courage, and what it meant to leave behind a legacy worth claiming. October's 3rd day arrived crisp and bright, carrying the restless energy that always wrapped the Larkspur Junction County Fair. By noon, a temporary town had risen around the grounds, crowded with families from ranches and homesteads scattered across 3 territories. The air smelled of roasting corn, wood smoke, and livestock waiting their turn to be judged. Lila wore an emerald riding dress, fine enough for the occasion, practical enough for uneven ground. With sturdy boots and no jewelry beyond her mother's ring, she wanted nothing to set her apart. Rosa Vale had braided her auburn hair simply, the style holding firm against the afternoon breeze. The fair pulsed with an easy joy she scarcely recognized. Children darting between stalls, women comparing quilts and preserves, men clustered at the pens, arguing breeding stock with grave seriousness. Laughter rose freely here, honest and unguarded, born of hard work and earned pleasure. Near the main platform, Clayton Baird held court among territorial officials and their wives, his voice carrying as he spoke of railroad expansion. When he spotted Lila, he tipped his hat with easy confidence, the gesture of a man certain their future was already decided. She turned away at once, slipping into the crowd as if the noise might shield her. At the far end of the fairgrounds, the timber-pulling contest had gathered a thick ring of onlookers. It was a brutal test of strength and skill. Men dragging enormous logs across measured ground with nothing but rope, leverage, and grit. The man to beat was a weathered rancher named Bram Cutter, who had hauled a 1,000-pound log nearly 30 feet before his strength finally failed. Then she noticed him. Cole Rourke stood just outside the ring, studying the logs with the calm focus of someone who understood exactly what the work demanded. He rose above the rest, well over 6 feet, broad shoulders straining the seams of a faded cotton shirt. His dark hair was too long, his jaw rough with several days' growth. What drew the eye wasn't swagger or bluster, but stillness, the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing to prove. His hands caught her attention. Even at a distance, she could see the scars and calluses earned through years of hard labor. Yet when he took hold of the rope, there was an unexpected care in the way he handled it, as if he knew strength alone wouldn't be enough. He slipped off his worn leather gloves and tucked them neatly into his belt. The small gesture spoke volumes. A man who minded his belongings because replacing them was never simple. "That's Cole Rourke," a woman said beside her. Lila turned to see Edna Pike, the blacksmith's wife, watching with open approval. Quiet sort, but there's no harder worker anywhere around. Helped my husband shoe horses all summer. Never asked for more than fair pay and a decent meal. Does he have family nearby? Lila Crow asked, keeping her tone light. None that I know of. Keeps to himself, but his name's solid. Honest as sunrise and strong as an ox, Edna said with a soft laugh. Half the unmarried women across 3 counties have their eyes on him, but he doesn't seem set on settling down. When Cole's turn came, the crowd fell silent. He walked to the largest log, the one that had beaten the last 2 men outright. Nearly 1,200 pounds, an impossible weight for most. He knelt, ran his hands along the wood to check for splinters that might cut the rope, then set his stance with the measured precision of someone who had done this kind of work before. The moment he leaned into the pull, Lila understood why the other women watched him so closely. Power and control moved together in him. He found the right angle, wasting nothing. Boots carving grooves into the packed dirt as sweat darkened his shirt. Inch by inch, he dragged the log forward. The crowd held its breath when he passed Bram Cutter's mark, then gasped as he carried it another 10 feet before finally letting go. When the judges finished measuring and called him the winner, Cole accepted the nods and handshakes with quiet grace. He slid his gloves back on with the same care he'd shown before, and collected his modest prize with a respectful dip of his head. No boasting, no spectacle. Just the calm satisfaction of work done right. That restraint stirred something deep in Lila. Here was a man who didn't borrow worth from titles or approval, who measured himself by what his hands could accomplish. The thought of him returning to a solitary life while she went back to dodging men like Clayton Baird felt suddenly unbearable. Before her courage could slip away, she moved toward him. The crowd around the contest ring had begun to thin when she reached the edge. Cole Rourke had stepped aside, allowing a young boy to admire the prize ribbon, explaining the rules with patient clarity and an easy kindness that softened his size. Up close, he was even more striking. Not only for his height, but for the quiet intelligence in his storm-gray eyes and the gentleness in his voice as he spoke to the excited child. When he noticed her waiting nearby, he rose to his full height and tipped the brim of his hat with plain respect. "Ma'am." For a heartbeat, the words she had practiced vanished, standing before a man who embodied everything solid and real her life lacked. Lila Crow suddenly felt fragile in her fine clothes, artificial in her polished speech. "Mr. Rourke," she said at last, surprised by the steadiness she found. "That was remarkable." "Thank you, ma'am. Just work that needed doing." His voice carried the rough edge of someone who didn't waste breath on empty talk. She sensed eyes turning toward them. A woman of her standing speaking alone with a laboring man would spark whispers. Crossing that invisible line only hardened her resolve. "I was hoping we might speak privately," she said, "about a matter that could benefit us both." Something shifted in his expression. Not distrust, but caution. The look of a man familiar with the trouble that wealth could bring. "Reckon that depends on the matter, ma'am." She drew a breath that seemed to pull courage from somewhere deep and unfamiliar. "My name is Lila Crow." She held his gaze. "I have a proposition for you." He knew the name, everyone did. But instead of calculation or flattery, his face remained neutral. "I'm listening." The words escaped before she could stop them. "I want you to give me strong sons." The air cracked. Conversations died mid-syllable. A tin cup clattered to the ground, sharp in the sudden hush. Someone gasped, Another voice muttered about indecency. Cole did not blink. He studied her with steady eyes, noting the color in her cheeks, the way her chin lifted as though she were bracing for impact. When he spoke, his voice was low enough for her alone. That's a bold offer, Miss Crow. But I figure you're after more than sons. What do you mean? He stepped closer, near enough for her to smell clean soap and honest sweat, near enough to catch the silver flecks in his eyes. He leaned down, his voice warm against her ear. I'll give you more than sons, ma'am. Her breath caught. I'll give you a life you can feel in your bones. The promise struck her like a blow, awakening wants she hadn't known how to name, a life lived, not observed from behind wealth and walls, but felt in joy, struggle, and real connection. When can we talk details? She asked, barely louder than a whisper. Tomorrow, he said. Sunset. By the old oak at the edge of your land. He straightened and tipped his hat once more. Good day, Miss Crow, as Cole Rourke walked off with the same unhurried stride that had first caught her eye. Lila Crow became acutely aware of how many people were watching. Dozens of gazes followed her. Whispers ignited and spread through the fairgrounds like dry grass catching flame. By nightfall, the entire territory would know that the Crow heiress had spoken shocking words to a working man at the county fair. Clayton Baird appeared at her side, his face flushed with equal parts anger and humiliation. Lila, what in God's name were you thinking? He hissed. You just made a public spectacle of yourself with a common laborer. She turned to him, calm in a way that surprised them both. I was thinking, Mr. Baird, that it's long past time I made my own decisions about my future. His hand clamped around her arm, hard enough to bruise. Your father will hear about this. There will be consequences. I'm counting on it, she replied, pulling free as she walked toward her carriage, past staring faces and murmured judgment. Lila felt something she hadn't known in years. Fear, yes, but also exhilaration. The reckless freedom of having burned her bridges and stepped into an unknown future. Tomorrow at sunset, she would meet Cole Rourke and learn whether his promise of a life she could feel in her bones was truth or fancy. The wedding ring warmed against her skin, pulsing as though Maeve Crow's spirit approved of her daughter finally daring to reach for something real. The storm waiting for her at home exceeded even her expectations. Warren Crow stood rigid in the marble foyer, every inch the avenging patriarch. His face was dark with the kind of fury Lila had seen only when business dealings collapsed beyond repair. In the parlor beyond, Clayton Baird sat with a glass of whiskey, nursing his pride like an open wound. Explain yourself, Warren demanded, without greeting or pause. Clayton tells me you made some indecent proposal to a drifter at the fair. Cole Rourke is hardly a drifter, Father, Lila said evenly. Edna Pike speaks very highly of his character and his work. His character? Warren's voice rose, sharp and dangerous. You publicly propositioned a man who likely can't read his own name. And you want to discuss character? Rosa Vale appeared in the hallway, dusting surfaces already spotless. She said nothing, but her presence steadied Lila more than words could. Rosa had weathered many of Warren's tempests and knew when silent loyalty mattered most. I offered him employment, Lila said carefully. Nothing more. Employment doing what exactly? Clayton cut in from the parlor doorway. Because half the territory heard you ask him to father your children. The accusation hung heavy, like smoke after a gunshot. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she did not look away or soften her stance. "My phrasing may have been unrefined," she said, "but my intentions were practical." She drew a breath. "The homestead property has been sitting idle for 3 years. It needs someone with the skill to make it productive again." That much, at least, was true. The Crow homestead lay 200 acres of good grazing land, an hour's ride from town, complete with a solid house, a barn, and service buildings. Warren had purchased it from a family heading farther west, once planning agricultural trials that never came to pass. Since then, it had stood untouched, a symbol of wealth unused, slowly gathering dust. "So you wish to hire a ranch hand," Warren Crow said slowly, each word weighed. "And your chosen method was to ask him to give you strong sons." "I misspoke in the heat of the moment," Lila Crow replied. "Nothing more." "You disgraced yourself, and this family," Clayton Baird cut in sharply. "Do you have any notion what people are saying? Edmund Crow's daughter behaving like a common trollop, throwing herself at the first laborer who caught her eye." The insult struck like a spark to dry tinder. Something fierce ignited in Lila's chest. "Better to offer myself to an honest man," she said coldly, "than to be traded like a prized mare." The slap came without warning. Clayton's palm cracked against her cheek, the sound ringing through the marble foyer. Rosa Vale gasped and moved forward, but Warren lifted a hand, stopping her. "You will apologize to Mr. Baird at once," he ordered, his voice deadly calm. Lila pressed her fingers to her burning cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. The pain sharpened her thoughts in a way years of pressure and polite obedience never had. With sudden clarity, she understood that this instant would shape the rest of her life. She could surrender to the future they demanded, or she could fight for the chance of something better. "No," she said. The word hung between them, stark and final. Warren's face drained white, then flushed red, the colors of a man realizing his most valuable possession had found its own will. "You will apologize," he said, "and you will marry Clayton within the month, or you will be cut off completely. No inheritance, no support, no claim to the Crow name." "Warren," Rosa said softly, the first time Lila had ever heard her speak his name without deference. "Perhaps this should wait until tempers cool." "Moo, stay out of this," Warren snapped. Though the command lacked its usual force, the threat he had issued was no idle one. It was meant to destroy her independence entirely. Lila squared her shoulders, drawing on strength she had never known she possessed. "I will consider your ultimatum, Father. In the meantime, I intend to inspect the homestead property. As you said, it has sat idle too long." She left them standing there and climbed the stairs with measured steps, spine straight, chin high. Only when she reached her room did she collapse into the chair by the window, shaking as the weight of what she had set in motion finally settled over her. The following evening, she rode out to the old oak marking the boundary of the homestead. The ancient tree stood on a low rise overlooking the valley, its thick trunk scarred by decades of Montana weather, yet still unbroken. As the sun washed the sky in amber and rose, she spotted a familiar figure approaching on foot. Cole Rourke moved across the land as if it were part of him, his long stride eating distance without haste. He had cleaned up since the fair. Fresh shirt, hair neatly combed, the stubble gone. The changes only sharpened the quiet dignity that had first drawn her eye. "Miss Crow," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I wasn't certain you'd come." "I keep my appointments, Mr. Rourke," she replied evenly. whatever follows them. Something in her voice made him look more closely, and she knew he could see the faint bruise despite the powder. I hope those circumstances weren't too hard on you, he said quietly. Nothing, she answered, that I didn't expect. She swung down from her horse, wanting to meet him eye to eye for this. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Rourke, Lila Crow said. A lawful business arrangement this time. Clear terms, fair benefit for both of us. He listened without interrupting as she laid it out. The homestead's neglect, the repairs it needed, and her need for someone with the skill to bring it back to life. She spoke of wages, housing, and the work that had to be done before winter tightened its grip. All the while, his gray eyes stayed on her, steady and intent, as though he were weighing more than her words. It's good ground, he said when she finished. I've passed it a few times over the years. The house has solid bones. Water rights are sound. A man could build something worth keeping there, he went on. Then his gaze sharpened. What I'm curious about is why you'd trust a place like that to a man you met yesterday, and what you're truly hoping to get from this. The bluntness of the question deserved honesty, even if it cost her. I want to build something real, she said. Something that exists because of work and intention, not inheritance or expectation. I need to prove, to myself most of all, that I'm capable of more than playing a decorative role. And if my family objects, she added quietly, I'll deal with that when it comes. Cole Rourke fell silent, looking out across the valley below. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a man shaped by hard-earned judgment. I'll work your land, Miss Crow, but I've got conditions. I work for you, not your father, not any other man who thinks he owns your choices. If you want to learn what needs doing, I'll teach you. But I won't labor while you stand back safe and untouched. And if this turns into anything more tangled than honest work for honest pay, he finished, I walk away. Agreed, she said without hesitation. They sealed it with a handshake. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm and steady. The contact lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. Long enough for her to register the strength in his hand and the calm certainty in his eyes. I can start tomorrow, he said. The barn needs attention before the weather turns. As they parted, Lila felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cooling air. For the first time in her adult life, she had acted on her own judgment, not the script written for her. Whatever followed, she would meet it as the author of her choices, not a passenger in someone else's design. The deed to the homestead sat locked in Warren Crow's safe. But she knew enough of the family business to understand that ownership could change hands. If her father carried out his threat to cut her off, she would need more than pride to secure her future. Riding home through the deepening dusk, Lila realized that hiring Cole Rourke was only the opening move in a far greater change. She was preparing to leave the world she'd been born into and build another from the ground up. And the man who had promised her a life she could feel in her bones would stand beside her in that risky undertaking. The first morning she arrived at the homestead, she found Cole already working in the barn. His sleeves were rolled up as he studied the sagging beams with a practiced eye. October's chill hinted at the winter ahead, her breath clouding as she approached the weathered structure that would soon become the heart of their shared effort. You're early, she said, noticing the sun had barely crested the mountains. Daylight's precious this time of year, Cole Rourke said, still focused on a stubborn roof beam. We'll need every hour we can get if we want this place ready before the snow sets in. Lila Crow stood nearby in one of her oldest riding skirts and a wool jacket. Practical by her standards. Yet beside his worn work shirt and solid boots, she felt overdressed all the same. It struck her then that she owned nothing meant for real labor. The thought was equal parts embarrassing and revealing. A reminder of how far removed she'd been from the work that kept people alive. "What can I do to help?" she asked. This time he looked at her, taking in her hopeful expression and impractical clothing with what might have been faint amusement. "Can you cook, Miss Crow?" "I can manage breakfast," she said, though her experience extended little beyond the simple meals Rosa Vale had once taught her as a girl. "Then I'd be grateful for coffee and whatever else you can put together. I brought supplies in my saddlebags." She found them in the cabin: coffee beans, bacon, eggs, and bread wrapped in oiled cloth. The kitchen was spare, but serviceable. The wood stove took several frustrating minutes to coax to life, smoke stinging her eyes before the flame finally caught. Outside, she heard the steady rhythm of his hammer, already beginning the work that would seal the barn against winter. When she called him in, Cole studied the slightly burned bacon and uneven eggs in polite silence before taking a bite. "It's good," he said. She suspected he would have said the same regardless. "You don't have to lie to spare me," she replied, taking a seat across from him at the rough wooden table. "I'm well aware my domestic skills need work." "Most skills do," he said mildly. "Willingness counts for more than polish." They ate in an easy quiet, broken only by wind rattling the windows and the distant calls of geese heading south. Sharing a plain meal with a man who valued honest effort over refinement felt more real than any lavish dinner she could remember. "Tell me what needs doing," she said when they finished. Cole pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, covered in neat, careful writing. "The barn roof comes first. No point storing hay or sheltering stock if it all gets soaked. Then we check the well pump, mend the fence lines, and cut enough firewood to last the winter." He continued, tapping the list. "The house is sound, but some windows don't close right. Chimney needs cleaning. Root cellar needs checking for storage." The list felt daunting, but his steady tone suggested he'd faced worse. As she watched him refold the paper, she noticed the care he took. Creases sharp, pencil point precise. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked. "My father was a cabinet maker back in Missouri," he said. "Before the war changed everything. He taught me that if you build something, you build it to last." He tucked the paper away and met her gaze. "What about you, Miss Crow? What are you hoping to learn out here?" The question surprised her. Its assumption that she was serious, not merely playing at frontier life. "I want to understand how things actually work," she said after a moment. "How to make something productive instead of just owning it." "That's a worthy aim," he said simply. The approval warmed her more than she expected. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm that felt natural. Lila arrived each morning with supplies and attempted breakfast while Cole handled the heaviest tasks. She proved more useful than she'd imagined, holding boards steady, mixing mortar for the chimney, organizing tools scattered through the barn. The work was harder than anything she had known. Her hands blistered, muscles ached in places she hadn't known existed. Yet alongside the pain came a deep, unfamiliar satisfaction, the sense of earning something real, long absent from her former life. Each time they finished mending a stretch of fence or replaced a cracked window, Lila felt a deep, steady satisfaction, the kind that came from solving real problems with her own hands. Cole Rourke taught with patience, never talking down to her, offering quiet corrections when she erred. When her nails bent instead of biting true, he showed her how to change her grip. When the wood stove refused to draw, he explained how air fed flame and how fire behaved when treated with respect. His knowledge ranged wide, from livestock care to reading weather signs, earned through years of work rather than schooling. On the fourth afternoon, during a break from splitting firewood, Lila Crow shaped a simple wooden spoon from a scrap of pine. What began as rough cuts slowly turned into something surprisingly useful, even graceful in its plain lines. "You've got good hands for this," Cole said, watching her smooth the bowl with careful strokes of sandpaper. "It's more satisfying than I expected," she admitted, surprised by the quiet pride of creating something from nothing. "That's the difference between building and buying," he replied. "When you make something yourself, it carries your intention. Every meal you eat with that spoon will remind you you're capable of more than you thought." The truth of it struck her. The spoon became proof, small, solid, that she could contribute something real. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, intending to keep it as a reminder of who she was becoming. That evening, as they shared another of her steadily improving meals, the talk turned personal. Cole asked about her schooling, her travels, the books she loved. In return, she learned of his wandering years after the war, the jobs that had brought him west, and his hope of owning land someday. Enough to raise horses. "You could do that here," she said without thinking. "The pasture's right for it. Good stock always finds buyers." "It's your land, Miss Crow," he said evenly, "not mine." "It could be shared," she answered, and felt warmth rise to her cheeks at what the words implied. He studied her by lamplight, those steady gray eyes, reading thoughts she hadn't fully named. "Is that what you want from this? A partnership beyond employer and hired hand?" The question deserved honesty. "I don't know what I want, Mr. Rourke. I only know I've never felt more myself than I have these past days. Working beside you, learning, building something that matters." She paused. "My family, my father, has given me an ultimatum. Marry Clayton Baird within the month, or lose everything tied to the Crow name." "That's a hard choice," he said quietly. "It would be," she replied. "If I hadn't already chosen, I'd rather have nothing with the chance to build something real than everything while living someone else's plan." Cole reached across the table and covered her hand with his, gentle, deliberate. "Then we'd best make sure what we build is worth the cost." The warmth of his touch and the promise in his words sent a shiver through her. Nothing to do with the night air. They sat together in the simple cabin, surrounded by tools and the marks of shared labor, and the future felt, at last, like something they were shaping themselves. Lila felt the first quiet stirrings of something deeper than cooperation, a bond that hinted at the kind of love her mother's old letters once described. When Cole Rourke walked her to her horse at dusk, his hand lingered as he helped her into the saddle. The touch was brief, restrained, yet charged with unspoken possibility. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "I'll be here," she said, knowing the promise meant far more than simply showing up for work. As she rode home beneath a sky crowded with stars, the wooden spoon tucked inside her jacket seemed warm against her ribs. A small, solid reminder that she was finally learning to build a future rather than inherit one. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Lila found herself in the mansion's attic, dust motes drifting through narrow light as she searched old trunks she hadn't opened in years. Rosa Vale had mentioned that some of her mother's belongings were stored there, and the deepening connection with Cole stirred a need to understand the woman who had once chosen love over expectation. The trunk sat beneath a yellowed sheet in a forgotten corner. Inside, wrapped in brittle tissue, lay her mother's wedding dress, ivory silk, simple and graceful. Modest even by the standards of decades past. Beneath it rested a wooden box holding jewelry, photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled as she untied it and opened the first page. The paper was fine, the handwriting unmistakably Warren Crow's. Younger, less assured than the bold script she knew from contracts and ledgers. "My dearest Maeve," it began, "I know a man of my rough beginnings has no right to court a woman of your refinement and learning. But since meeting you at the church social last Sunday, I've been unable to think of anything else." Letter after letter revealed a courtship, nothing like the cool partnership she remembered from later years. Her father's words brimmed with devotion, wildflowers gathered by hand, dreams of a life shaped together rather than dictated by society. "I may never offer grand houses or fine clothes," one letter read, "but I swear every day with me will be filled with a love that cherishes you for who you are, not what you represent." Her mother's replies were just as fervent. "They say I'm throwing away my future," Maeve had written. "But they don't understand that true security comes from being wholly loved, not grudgingly provided for." The later letters traced their early marriage, the struggle to establish mining claims, the joy of Lila's birth, the slow deepening of passion into something steady and enduring. Then the tone shifted. As success grew, so did distance. Warren's letters shortened, crowded with practical concerns. Maeve's words carried a quiet loneliness as her husband became consumed by building his empire. The final letter, dated only months before her mother's death, was addressed to a sister back east. "I fear Warren has forgotten the man who once courted me with such beautiful words," Maeve wrote. "Success has hardened him. I sometimes wonder if he sees me as another possession rather than the woman he claimed he couldn't live without. I pray Lila will have the courage to choose differently when her time comes." Lila sank back on her heels, the letter clenched in her hands. The reflection of her mother's life and her own choices was painful and clarifying. For the first time, she understood not only what she was running from, but what she was determined to protect. Maeve had chosen love over society's rigid expectations, just as Lila now found herself considering. And yet that choice had been tangled and tested by the very success it helped create. "Miss Lila," Rosa Vale's voice called up from the foot of the attic stairs. "Your father is asking for you in his study." Lila carefully gathered the letters, retied the faded ribbon, and returned them to the trunk. As she descended the stairs, her thoughts were still caught between the tender young man revealed in those pages and the formidable figure who now ruled the household. The contrast was jarring. Warren Crow stood at the study window, gazing out over the town his ambition had helped shape. His broad shoulders carried years of responsibility. And for the first time, Lila saw him not only as an obstacle to her freedom, but as a man who might have lost something vital along the way. "Harrison tells me you've been spending a great deal of time at the old homestead," he said without turning. "I've been overseeing the restoration," Lila replied evenly. "It's progressing well, with Cole Rourke assisting as hired help." Warren finished, finally facing her. To her surprise, his expression held something close to sadness. "Lila, You must understand, he continued. A woman of your standing carries obligations beyond personal desire. Your marriage affects business ties, social position, and the stability of everyone connected to the Crow name. And how did Mother's marriage affect those things? Lila asked quietly, when she chose to marry a poor prospector. The question struck home. Warren's composure faltered just for a moment. Your mother's situation was different, he said at last. I had ambition. I had plans. I was determined to give her everything she deserved. You gave her security, Lila replied. But did you love her the way you promised in your letters? Warren went completely still. What letters? The ones where you swore to cherish her for who she was, Lila said softly. Not for what she represented. For a long moment, father and daughter faced one another across the years of silence and misunderstanding. Then Warren's expression shifted, surprise giving way to pain, then to a weary acceptance that seemed to age him instantly. You found them in the attic, he said quietly. I always wondered what became of Maeve's things. She kept every letter, Lila said. They're beautiful, Father. They show a man capable of the love she believed in. Warren lowered himself into his leather chair, as if his strength had suddenly failed him. I was a different man then, he admitted. Poorer, perhaps, but richer in ways that mattered more. What changed? Lila asked. Success, he said after a pause. Responsibility. The burden of providing, of protecting what I'd built. He studied his hands, still rough beneath years of fine gloves. Your mother deserved security, and I was so focused on giving it to her that I forgot she'd married me for something else. The admission settled between them, fragile and unexpected. For the first time, Lila understood that her father's rigid control might be rooted not in pride alone, but in regret. It's not too late, she said gently, to remember who you were when you wrote those letters. Perhaps not for me, Warren replied. But I won't watch you make the opposite mistake. Your mother chose love over security, and spent her later years watching me become a man she barely recognized. You're thinking of choosing a man with no guarantees over one who can offer you comfort, position, and certainty, Warren Crow said quietly. Cole Rourke has prospects, Father, Lila Crow replied without hesitation. He has integrity, skill, and the kind of character that builds something that lasts. They're the same qualities you had when Mother chose you. And if you're wrong? Warren pressed. If he turns out to be nothing more than a smooth drifter who sees you as an easy path to comfort? Lila pictured Cole's careful handling of his tools, the patience in his voice when he taught her, the respect he showed the land and animals he spoke of, as if they were living partners rather than possessions. Then I'll face the cost of my decision, she said steadily. Just as Mother faced the cost of hers. Warren studied her face, perhaps recognizing the same stubborn resolve he once carried himself. You're refusing Clayton Baird's proposal. I already have, Lila answered, in everything but words. You understand what that means, he said. For your inheritance, your standing, your future security. I do, she said softly. And some things matter more than security. You believed that once, too. When you courted a school teacher whose family thought you weren't good enough, the comparison landed cleanly. Warren let out a short laugh that held more pain than amusement. Your mother would have admired your courage, he said, even if she might have questioned your judgment. Will you meet him? Lila asked. Cole, I mean. Will you hear him out before you decide what we're trying to build? Silence stretched so long, she nearly lost hope. Then Warren spoke, his voice tired, stripped of command. Bring him to dinner tomorrow night. I'll listen to what he has to say. Relief and fear hit her at once. And Clayton, Warren added. I'll inform Mr. Baird that the engagement he assumed was never going to happen. He can take his ambitions elsewhere. When Lila left the study, her hands were trembling. By the next evening, the two most important men in her life would face one another across her father's table. What followed would decide whether she moved forward into something real, or spent years rebuilding what she'd burned in pursuit of it. That night at the homestead, she told Cole Rourke about the invitation as they ate a pot of beef stew that was finally edible thanks to weeks of his patient guidance. Your father wants to size me up, Cole said calmly, not a trace of unease in his voice. He wants to understand why I'm willing to give up everything I inherited, Lila said, for the chance to build something with you. And if he asks you that directly? Cole asked, the question settled between them, heavy with everything they'd been circling around. Lila set down her spoon and met his steady gray eyes. I'll tell him I've fallen in love with a man who sees me for who I am, not what I represent. A man who's teaching me that real security comes from being valued fully, not managed or traded. The truth of it startled them both. Cole reached for her hand, his thumb brushing slow, reassuring circles over her knuckles. And I'll tell him I love his daughter enough to spend my life proving she made the right choice. Even if it means starting from nothing, he continued, with only our hands and the will to build something worthy of her courage. When he leaned across the table to kiss her, it felt less like a stolen moment and more like a vow. The future ahead was uncertain, but what they were building together felt as solid as the cabin walls around them. As they stood together in the soft glow of the lamp, surrounded by tools and the quiet proof of their shared labor, Lila Crow felt a deep sense of rightness settle into her bones. It was the same calm completion she imagined her mother had felt years ago when she chose love over convention. Tomorrow night would bring judgment and consequence. But this moment belonged to certainty. The knowledge that what she and Cole Rourke were building had weight and endurance, something that would outlast gossip and doubt. That certainty cracked unexpectedly while she helped him prepare for the evening in his modest cabin. As she moved past the table, her elbow caught his saddlebags, sending them tumbling to the floor. Clothes and everyday necessities spilled out, followed by a leather portfolio she had never seen. It fell open, exposing official papers stamped with military seals and the unmistakable heading of the United States War Department. Cole? She said, lifting the documents, her voice curious rather than accusatory. What are these? He stepped out from the back room, where he'd been struggling to smooth his best shirt, and froze when he saw the papers. The steady ease she knew so well drained from him, replaced by something close to shame. Those are things I don't talk about, he said quietly, kneeling to gather them. But she had already seen enough. The top page was a discharge dated 1865, signed by a colonel. What caught her breath was the rank listed. Not private, not sergeant, but major, followed by citations for distinguished service and valor. You were an officer, she said softly, surprise slipping through despite her effort to contain it. I was a lot of things during the war, he replied, stacking the papers with practiced care. Most of them aren't worth remembering. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. He secured the portfolio, then finally met her eyes. Because I've spent 15 years trying to forget the man those papers describe. The war turned me into someone I didn't want to be. When it ended, I chose to start over. He drew a breath. Someone who fixes barns and splits firewood instead of leading men into battle. Someone who builds instead of destroys. Someone who can sleep without hearing the screams of boys who followed my orders into places they never should have been. The pain in his voice cut deep. She reached for his hands, noticing scars she had once assumed came from ordinary labor, now understanding they might carry heavier stories. The war ended 24 years ago, she said gently. You were barely more than a boy when it began. Old enough to make choices that got good men killed, he said. Old enough to carry orders that still wake me some nights soaked in sweat. She studied his face, seeing new meaning in the quiet competence she trusted so completely. His patience, his caution, his refusal to rush decisions, all of it made sense now. Is that why you chose this life? She asked. Working alone? Avoiding responsibility over other people? Partly, he admitted. I figured I'd done enough harm for several lifetimes. Better to spend what's left doing work that helps instead of hurts. The truth of it reframed everything. His care with tools, his insistence on safety, his hesitation whenever her future was involved. She saw him more clearly than ever, not diminished by his past, but shaped by it, and deliberately choosing to be better every day. Everything about him spoke of a man who had learned to place other people's lives above his own ambition. My father will want to know about your military service, Lila Crow said carefully. It may actually count in your favor. He respects men who served. And when he learns what kind of service it was, Cole Rourke replied, bitterness edging his voice. When he realizes his daughter loves a man who spent 4 years learning how to kill. She stepped closer and framed his face with her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. Then he'll learn that his daughter loves a man who walked through hell and chose to spend the rest of his life building instead of destroying. A man who turned away from violence and decided to make something good with what he had left. His expression softened, though the weariness still lingered in his gray eyes. You don't know everything those papers hold, Lila. There are orders I carried out, decisions I made, things that could change how you see me. Nothing in those papers will erase the weeks you spent teaching me to trust myself. She said quietly. Nothing will change how you care for injured animals or how you mend broken things as if they matter. Nothing will undo the fact that you showed me what it feels like to be truly seen. She kissed him, pouring every ounce of certainty she possessed into the moment. When they parted, some of the tension had eased from his shoulders. Even if the shadows remained, your father deserves the truth, Cole said at last. I won't begin this life with you by hiding the most important parts of who I am. They arrived at the Crow Mansion as the sun dipped low, throwing long shadows across the manicured grounds that had never felt so artificial to Lila. Cole wore his best suit, dark, worn, but carefully kept, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that even her father's imposing parlor could not diminish. Warren Crow greeted them with measured courtesy. When the two men shook hands, it was with the mutual respect of equals. Though Lila saw her father quietly assessing everything. Cole's grip, his posture, the steadiness of his gaze. Mr. Rourke, Warren said, my daughter tells me you've been restoring the homestead. Yes, sir. It's good land. With a few more weeks of work, it'll be ready to produce again. And what do you intend to produce? The question was calm, but probing. Dinner unfolded with careful diplomacy. Warren asked about Cole's background, his intentions, and whether he could provide for a woman raised in considerable comfort. Cole answered plainly, neither exaggerating his strengths nor apologizing for his circumstances. When the subject of military service arose, Cole did not evade it. He spoke briefly and honestly about his rank, his years of service, and his decision to leave that life behind when the war ended. A major at such a young age, Warren observed. That implies considerable leadership and trust from your superiors. It mostly means I survived, Cole replied. The war made soldiers out of boys who would have chosen different lives if they'd been given the chance. And yet you set that path aside for manual labor. I set aside violence to build something useful, Cole said. There's dignity in honest work, no matter what form it takes. A faint smile crossed Warren's face, as if he recognized an echo of his own younger self in those words. His gaze shifted briefly to his daughter. Lila seems to believe the two of you are building something that matters, he said. We are, sir, Cole Rourke said evenly. We're trying to build something that lasts, something grounded in shared effort and mutual respect, not convenience or social rank. And if I object, Warren Crow replied, his tone measured. If I insist my daughter's future belongs with a man better suited to her position. Cole met the challenge without flinching. Then I'd honor your role as her father and hope time would prove the value of what we're building together. The answers seemed to satisfy an unspoken test. As Rosa Vale served dessert, Warren's questions softened, shifting from scrutiny to genuine curiosity about the homestead. How the repairs were coming along, how Cole planned to make the place self-sustaining through winter. When the evening drew to a close, Warren walked them to the door, his expression unreadable. Mr. Rourke, he said, offering his hand once more. I appreciate your candor about your past and your intentions. Thank you for hearing me out, sir. I'd like to visit the homestead soon, Warren added. See for myself what you've accomplished. You'd be welcome any time, Cole replied. As they headed toward the carriage, Lila Crow felt a cautious lift in her chest. Her father hadn't given his blessing, but he hadn't forbidden the relationship either, nor renewed his ultimatum about Clayton Baird. That went better than I expected, she said as Cole helped her up. Your father's sharp, Cole answered. But he's fair. He's willing to let our work speak for us. And the military papers? She asked quietly. Do you regret being honest about them? Cole considered as he climbed beside her. No. Anything meant to last has to be built on truth, not omissions. They drove through the moonlit land toward the homestead, the wheels humming softly. Lila felt the steady relief of another obstacle cleared. The truth of Cole's past had deepened her understanding and shown her father a man worthy of respect, not suspicion. Whatever waited ahead, they would face it together, choosing honesty even when it carried old pain. The reckoning that revealed the forces aligned against them arrived with violence. Lila rode up to the homestead to find Cole standing amid the wreckage of their restored barn. His jaw was set as he surveyed the damage, deliberate, methodical destruction. The structure hadn't failed. It had been sabotaged. Support beams bore clean saw marks. The new roof lay shredded and twisted. Their neatly arranged tools were flung into the mud. Worst of all, red paint screamed across the remaining wall. Ashcroft's not welcome. How much can we save? Lila asked. though she already knew. Very little, Cole said, kneeling to examine a beam weakened on purpose. This wasn't random. Whoever did this wanted us to start over. She picked her way through splintered boards and broken glass, boots crunching on scattered nails. The destruction felt intimate, aimed straight at the heart of what they'd built together. Who would do this? She asked. Someone who wants you back where they think you belong, Cole said, straightening with a length of severed rope in his hand. The question is whether they acted alone or on someone else's orders. The answer came 3 hours later, when it became clear the damage went far beyond petty vandalism. While Cole Rourke stayed behind to brace what little could be saved, Lila Crow rode into town to report the crime to Sheriff Reed Walker and pick up replacement supplies. Inside the general store, she paused near the back shelves and heard a conversation that chilled her to the bone. 2 men she didn't recognize were speaking with Silas Kern, the territorial land commissioner, in tones they clearly believed were private. "The Iron Spur Syndicate is losing patience," one of the men said. "They've sunk real money into locking down those mining rights, and they won't accept much more delay." "Warren Crow isn't a fool," Kern replied. "He started asking questions about survey discrepancies and claim filings. If he figures out what's been done, then we make sure he doesn't." The second man cut in. "His daughter's infatuation with that cowboy is the perfect smokescreen. Keep Crow focused on family scandal while we finish the transfers." Lila pressed herself flat against the wall, her pulse roaring in her ears. They spoke of her family's claims as if ownership had already changed hands, and of her relationship with Cole as a deliberate distraction. "What about the homestead?" Kern asked. "She's been spending a lot of time out there with her hired man." "That land isn't tied to the mineral package," the man said. "But it becomes a problem if they establish anything permanent. Better to discourage the romance before it goes too far. Hence the barn." "A warning," Kern added coolly. "If that fails, we escalate until she comes to her senses." Lila waited until they left before stepping into the open, her mind racing. The attack hadn't been personal. It was calculated, part of a larger scheme to steal the Crow mining claims through forged paperwork, intimidation, and misdirection. She rode hard back to the homestead, thoughts boiling like a gathering storm. "We need to go through the legal documents," she told Cole the moment she arrived. "Something is very wrong with the claims, and the people behind it are the same ones who wrecked the barn." Cole listened without interrupting as she repeated every word she'd overheard. His face darkened as the shape of the conspiracy came into focus. "This explains why your father was being pushed to rush your marriage," he said when she finished. "If survey reports were altered or filings manipulated, they needed him distracted while the theft was finalized." "Can you help me investigate?" she asked. "With your military background, you must have dealt with things like this." "Intelligence gathering and document analysis were part of my duties," Cole replied. "But if we're up against territorial officials and railroad money, suspicion won't be enough. We'll need proof that stands in court." They spent the rest of the day riding between the claims, comparing boundary markers on the ground with descriptions from the papers Lila had taken from her father's safe. What they uncovered was more audacious than simple claim jumping. Survey reports had been altered, quietly, surgically. A few degrees shifted here, a landmark misnamed there. Small changes that, taken together, redirected valuable ground into the hands of interests controlled by the railroad. It was theft disguised as bureaucracy, and it was already well underway. But taken together, they amounted to thousands of acres of mineral-rich ground being quietly shifted from rightful ownership into the hands of a syndicate that had paid nothing for it. "Look at this," Cole Rourke said, tapping a finger against one of the survey plats. "According to the original filing, your father's claim runs all the way to that ridge." He slid the amended map beside it. "This version pulls the boundary back nearly a quarter mile. Dated 6 months ago, right about when Warren Crow began pushing you hard about marriage." The pattern sharpened into something unmistakable, while the conspirators steadily stripped away the Crow mining claims. They used Warren's anxiety over his daughter's future to keep him distracted from his business affairs. Lila's growing attachment to Cole had become an even more effective diversion. A family crisis loud enough to demand attention, while the real theft unfolded in silence. By the time dusk settled over the valley, they rode back to the homestead carrying proof that could expose the scheme, and the knowledge that they were now in real danger. The wrecked barn had not been random. It had been a warning. "If they realize we figured this out," Cole said as they secured the papers in a concealed compartment beneath the cabin floor, "the next response won't be symbolic." "We have to tell my father," Lila Crow agreed. "But we also have to assume some of his usual channels can't be trusted. If territorial officials are involved, the law itself may already be compromised." Almost on cue, the sound of hooves drifted in through the open window. 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk. Lila's breath caught when she recognized one of them as Clayton Baird. "Company," Cole murmured, his hand moving by instinct toward the hunting rifle mounted above the hearth. "Let me speak first," Lila said, though her pulse hammered hard enough that she feared it showed. Clayton Baird dismounted with the confidence of a man accustomed to control. His 2 companions stayed mounted, hands resting openly on their gun belts. "Lila, my dear," Baird called, his voice smooth and loud. "I've come to discuss your future with you and your hired man." "We have nothing to discuss, Clayton," she replied. "On the contrary," he said, stepping closer. "We have quite a lot to discuss, beginning with your decision to abandon a suitable match in favor of playing frontier games with a drifter." Cole stepped onto the porch beside her, his presence steady and unmistakably protective. "You're on private land," he said evenly. "State your business or leave." "My business," Baird replied, a sharp edge cutting through his charm, "is the Crow family name and your reputation. Both are being damaged by this arrangement. What I do on my property is none of your concern," Lila said. "Everything connected to the Crow name is my concern," Baird countered, smiling thinly, "especially given my professional ties to your father." His gaze slid to Cole, cold and appraising. "There are matters at play here you don't understand, Mr. Rourke. Commercial interests that outweigh romantic notions." The threat no longer needed dressing. But Lila was no longer the woman who had spoken impulsively at a county fair. "I understand more than you think, Clayton," she said quietly, "including your associations with certain railroad interests and certain territorial officials." For the first time, Baird's composure cracked. The confidence in his eyes flickered, replaced by something darker. "I think," he said slowly, "you should come with me tonight, Lila. There are men who would very much like to question your recent behavior." It was Cole Rourke who answered, his voice steady with the calm authority of someone who had once led others into danger. "She isn't going anywhere with you. I suggest you ride out now, before this turns into something you can't control." The silence between them stretched tight as a drawn wire. At last, Clayton Baird swung back into his saddle. His retreat carried no humility, only menace. "This isn't finished, Lila," he said. "Your choices carry consequences, and they reach far beyond your personal affairs." When the three riders disappeared into the dark, the last illusion of protection fell away. Lila understood then that what they had uncovered went far beyond a land dispute. This was a network of power, men willing to threaten, destroy, and kill to keep their schemes intact. Fear rose in her chest, sharp and real. But beneath it burned something stronger. They had proof, not just of crimes against her family, but against countless others whose land had been quietly stolen. The choice before them was stark: surrender to corruption, or stand against it and pay whatever price followed. As Cole barred the door, checked the windows, and set his rifle within reach, Lila realized their quiet, hard-won love had become something else entirely. They were no longer just building a future together. They were standing in the path of men who ruled the Montana Territory through money and fear. Morning arrived with hoofbeats. Warren Crow rode up fast, his face drawn tight with a fury Lila had never seen. Rosa Vale followed close behind on her old mare, her presence alone signaling how grave the situation had become. "Lila," Warren said as he dismounted, "thank God you're unharmed." "Safe from what?" she asked, though the answer already lived in his eyes. "Clayton Baird came to me last night," Warren said. "He claimed you and Rourke threatened him when he tried to discuss your engagement. He's talking about bringing charges before Marshal Grant." Cole stepped onto the porch, rifle resting easy in his hands. "He's free to file whatever he likes," he said evenly, "but he may not enjoy the attention it brings to his own dealings." Warren took in the ruined barn, the scattered beams, the sawed supports. He looked at his daughter. No hesitation in her stance, no fear in her eyes. "Tell me the truth," he said. "All of it." Inside the cabin, they laid everything before him. Altered surveys, falsified filings, shifted boundaries, and the conversation Lila had overheard in town. Warren examined each page in silence, his jaw tightening. "These are my claims," he said at last, stabbing a finger at one map. "That ridge line has been moved back nearly half a mile. That's thousands, tens of thousands, in mineral rights." "It goes deeper," Lila said quietly. "Show him the land office records." The documents Cole had gathered told a single, unmistakable story: systematic fraud, coordinated theft, and men powerful enough to believe no one would ever dare stop them. Claims filed generations ago had been quietly altered to favor railroad interests. The revisions backdated to give the illusion of legality. Land that had belonged to families for decades was being funneled into a syndicate that existed only in ledgers and letterhead. "This isn't simple theft," Warren Crow said, his voice low and lethal. "This is a coordinated conspiracy, one meant to strip dozens of owners across 3 territories. And it takes enormous money to pull it off," Cole Rourke added. "Enough to buy territorial officials, judges, and to engineer distractions, including convenient marriage negotiations that keep powerful landowners looking the other way." The truth struck Warren like a blow to the chest. His discussions with Clayton Baird hadn't been about securing his daughter's future at all. They had been about ensuring his attention stayed fixed on domestic matters while his holdings were quietly carved apart. "My God," he whispered. "Maeve would have seen this instantly. She always read people better than I did." Rosa Vale, who had listened without a word, stepped closer and rested a steady hand on Lila Crow's shoulder. "What do we do now, Senor Warren? Men like this do not stop just because papers are uncovered." "We expose them," Warren said, resolve hardening his features. "But we do it carefully, and with allies we trust without question." Over the next hours, they shaped a plan that demanded precision and nerve. The Harvest Festival, scheduled for the following weekend, would draw territorial officials, businessmen, and landowners from across the region. It offered the one stage where the evidence could be revealed publicly, where it could not be quietly buried. "We'll need men whose integrity is beyond doubt," Warren said, studying a list he'd written on the back of one of the forged maps. "Judge Elias Holt," Cole suggested. "He served honorably during the war and owes nothing to railroad money." "And Sheriff Reed Walker," Warren added. "He's already been questioning suspicious transfers in his county." "What about the territorial governor?" Lila asked. "Compromised," her father replied without hesitation. "Half his campaign was bankrolled by the same syndicate behind this." As the plan took shape, Rosa kept watch at the windows, her eyes sharp for any sign of movement. The ruined barn had been a warning, one they could not ignore. "There's something else," Lila said once the details were settled. She returned from the bedroom carrying a small wooden box that had belonged to Hattie Crow. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a pearl-handled derringer. "My grandmother carried this during the troubles of the 60s, Lila said at Cole's look. "She believed a woman should be ready to defend what matters most." Cole examined the weapon with practiced care. "It's well kept. Do you know how to use it?" "Rosa taught me when I was 16. Father objected. Mother insisted." "A wise woman," Cole said, handing it back. "Keep it close. Men with this much to lose won't concern themselves with manners." That evening, as Warren and Rosa rode back toward town to quietly contact their allies, Lila and Cole sat side by side on the cabin porch. The mountains burned gold and crimson beneath the setting sun, the calm beauty at odds with the danger closing in around them. "Are you afraid?" Lila asked softly, her fingers lacing with his in the deepening dusk. "I'm afraid of losing you," Clay Rourke admitted quietly. "Afraid I won't be able to protect what we've built together. But I'm not afraid of standing up to men who think they can rob honest folks without consequence. I've never felt more alive than I have these past weeks," May Calder said. "Working beside you, learning from you, finding out what I can do once I stop living inside other people's limits." Whatever waited for them at the festival, she wanted him to know one thing clearly. He had given her exactly what he promised, a life she could feel down to her bones. Clay kissed her then, a kiss heavy with resolve and unspoken vows. When they drew apart, his thumb traced her jaw with a tenderness that steadied her heart. "When this is finished," he said, "I want to marry you the right way. Not out of duty or arrangement, but because I can't picture a future that doesn't mean building something lasting with you." "Yes," May answered at once. "But first, there's a conspiracy to expose and justice to see done." The next morning brought trouble. Sheriff Amos Hale rode in with word that Eli Boone had filed formal charges, claiming Clay threatened him and that May was being held at the ranch against her will. "It's nonsense," the sheriff said, uneasy, "but it could be enough to send a marshal with a warrant." "Or worse," Clay muttered. "They could say I resisted arrest." An hour later, Silas Rourke arrived with help. 3 men he trusted, all armed, all willing to stand between May and anyone who meant her harm. Seeing decent men ready to face corruption gave her a flicker of hope. "Judge Elias Holt has agreed to review our evidence," Silas said. "And Sheriff Reed Walker is bringing similar records from his county. If we stand together at the festival, we might expose this before they bury it." "And if we can't?" May asked. "Then we fight," Silas said simply. "Some things matter more than safety." As they prepared, May slipped her grandmother's derringer into her skirt pocket and checked it once more. The weight of it reminded her she was no longer a sheltered woman clinging to comfort. She was ready to fight. For the man she loved, for the truth, for the future they meant to claim. The festival was 3 days away. In that time, they would gather allies, secure proof, and brace for a confrontation that could either shatter the conspiracy or ruin them all. Watching Clay check his rifle, May felt the same mix of fear and exhilaration she'd known the day she first spoke her heart to a stranger. Some choices, she knew, were worth any risk. Some futures were worth fighting for. And some loves were strong enough to stand against whatever powerful men dared to unleash. The Harvest Festival was meant to be a celebration. But for Lila Crow, it would be a reckoning. Everything she and Cole Rourke had built, their partnership, their love, their shared belief that justice still mattered in a lawless territory, would be tested in the open. Failure would cost them more than a future. It could cost them their lives. Yet as Lila felt the reassuring weight of Hattie Crow's derringer at her side and sensed Cole's steady presence nearby, she knew with absolute clarity that she was exactly where she belonged, standing for exactly what mattered. Morning broke sharp and cold. The Montana sky washed clean with a pale light that made the mountains look honed like blades. By midday, the fairgrounds overflowed with families from distant ranches and isolated homesteads, all drawn together to mark another hard year survived. Lila stood on the main platform beside Judge Elias Holt, watching the crowd gather around the gazebo where the ceremony usually began. In her hands rested a worn leather portfolio. Inside lay the original town charter, proof that the Iron Spur Syndicate's claims were rooted in fraud. Sheriff Reed Walker had uncovered it deep in the territorial archives, buried beneath decades of routine filings. Its seals and signatures predated every suspicious amendment and could be verified beyond dispute, exposing the conspiracy in black ink. "Are you ready for this?" Judge Holt asked under his breath, the gravity of the moment etched into his lined face. "As ready as anyone can be," Lila replied, surprised by the calm in her own voice. To accuse half the territory of theft. Across the crowd, she spotted Cole near the rear steps of the platform. He looked relaxed, almost casual. But she recognized the soldier in him, the way his eyes tracked movement, the way his body angled subtly toward danger. Warren Crow stood nearby with Sheriff Walker and several other lawmen whose reputations were still clean, their presence a quiet signal that justice had not yet been fully bought. Near the bandstand, Clayton Baird held court, flanked by men Lila now knew too well. Silas Kern, the territorial land commissioner, was there, along with Milton Crane, representing railroad interests, and other officials whose names stained the documents in her hands. They moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of men convinced the world belonged to them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Holt called, his voice carrying over the fairgrounds, "if I may have your attention." The chatter faded. Families stepped closer, expecting familiar words of welcome. What followed was anything but familiar. "We gather today not only to celebrate our harvest," the judge said evenly, "but to confront a corruption that has taken root among us. Evidence has come to light of systematic fraud, committed against property owners throughout this territory. A shock rippled through the crowd. Conversations died. Faces turned toward the platform. Confusion gave way to anger. Clayton Baird surged forward. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "A public festival is no place for baseless accusations." "On the contrary," Judge Holt replied, his voice firm with decades of authority. "When public officials betray the people, the public deserves the truth." Lila stepped forward then, the portfolio pressed tight against her chest like a shield. "My name is Lila Crow," she said clearly. 3 weeks ago, I learned that mining claims legally owned by my family were being transferred to railroad interests through forged records and altered surveys. The murmur swelled into shouts. Recognition, anger, fear, from landowners who had suffered the same quiet theft. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. Lila could see it happening in real time. Faces in the crowd tightening as understanding took hold. Ranchers who had lost grazing land. Miners whose claims had shrunk without explanation. Homesteaders whose boundary markers no longer matched the ground beneath their boots. Her words were stitching their separate grievances into one unmistakable pattern. "These are grave allegations," Silas Kern barked as he forced his way through the gathering toward the platform. "I demand to see proof before this spectacle turns into a witch hunt." "The proof is right here," Lila answered steadily, opening the leather portfolio. "This charter, filed in the Territorial Archives in 1867, establishes the original legal boundaries. Boundaries your amended surveys have repeatedly violated." She read aloud, her voice carrying clean and sharp across the fairgrounds. Each legal description cut against the forged filings the conspirators had used. With every reference point, voices rose from the crowd, men recognizing their own land, their own losses, named line by line. Cole moved closer to the platform, the rifle resting easy against his shoulder. To an untrained eye, he looked calm, almost idle. To anyone who had ever worn a uniform, his stance spoke of control. Angles covered, exits watched, danger measured before it struck. "This is absurd," Clayton Baird snapped, striding up the steps with practiced arrogance. "A spoiled heiress and her hired gun don't get to derail legitimate business with wild accusations." "Then explain this," Sheriff Reed Walker called out, producing a folded letter. "Your handwriting, Mr. Baird, discussing the timing of survey changes with Commissioner Kern." The color drained from Kern's face. Baird's confidence cracked for just a heartbeat. "Where did you get that?" Kern demanded. "From your own files," Walker replied coolly. "Funny what turns up when honest lawmen start looking." The crowd surged, anger replacing confusion as the truth settled in. Separate losses merged into one stolen fortune. Then Milton Crane, the railroad man, stepped forward, his voice cutting cold through the noise. "That's enough. I'm placing Miss Crow and her accomplices under citizen's arrest for false accusations against territorial officials," he signaled, and men scattered through the crowd began pushing forward. Hard-eyed, unfamiliar, hands slipping toward hidden weapons. They were no farmers, no ranch hands. "Down!" Cole shouted. He brought the rifle up in one smooth motion as the hired men revealed themselves. Panic ripped through the fairgrounds as people realized this wasn't an argument. It was an attempted seizure of power. Judge Elias Holt seized the charter from Lila's hands and lifted it high. "This document proves it all," he roared. The Iron Spur Syndicate has been stealing your land through bribery and forged records. A gunshot cracked through the air. Lila's fingers closed around the derringer in her pocket, heart hammering as the truth settled in. The fight for justice was no longer words and paper. It had begun in blood and noise, in the open daylight, where everyone could see exactly who was willing to kill to keep the truth buried. The quiet harvest celebration had turned into a proving ground, where the fate of the territory and Lila's life with Cole would be decided by nerve, proof, and the will of honest people to defend what had been stolen from them. The gunshot that split the crisp morning air came from one of Milton Crane's hired men. He didn't aim at a person. He aimed at the papers in Judge Elias Holt's hands. The bullet ripped through the original town charter, shredding the priceless document and scattering fragments across the platform like dry leaves torn from a tree. "The evidence is destroyed," Clayton Baird shouted, his voice sharp with triumph. "Without those papers, you've got nothing but reckless accusations." But Lila had learned more than domestic lessons during her weeks beside Cole. She had learned foresight. She had learned not to stand on a single pillar when everything worth protecting could be knocked down. With a calm that surprised even her, she reached into her coat and drew out a second leather portfolio. "Actually, Mr. Baird," she said clearly, "we have copies of everything. Sheriff Reed Walker photographed the originals before we ever brought them here." The response from the crowd was thunderous. Ranchers and miners who had been quietly cheated surged forward, their anger finally given a name and a face. The hired guns found themselves suddenly outnumbered by armed, furious citizens who now understood how carefully and how long they had been robbed. The balance shifted fast. Cole's military instincts took over without effort. "Form up behind the platform," he called. "Don't let them get near the evidence." Men moved where he pointed, not because he barked orders, but because his voice carried certainty. Still, the conspirators weren't finished. Clayton Baird yanked a folded paper from his coat and raised it like a banner. "I hold a territorial warrant for the arrest of Lila Crow and Cole Rourke," he declared, "for threatening a territorial official and conspiring against the Iron Spur Syndicate." "That warrant is a lie," Judge Holt snapped. "I know, because my signature on it was forged." The admission ignited the crowd all over again. Forged warrants, forged surveys, forged authority. But it also gave Crane's men the excuse they wanted. "Resist arrest and suffer the consequences," Crane shouted, drawing his pistol. The fight that followed would be remembered as the day ordinary people finally pushed back. Cole fired first, not to kill, but to disarm. His shot was precise, stripping a gun from a man's hand and sending it spinning into the dirt. Warren Crow and his Crow foremen closed ranks around the platform, rifles steady, bodies forming a shield around Lila and the evidence she carried. Sheriff Walker and his deputies moved through the chaos, isolating hired guns, dragging them down before they could fire. Then Lila felt fingers clamp around her wrist, hard enough to bite. She spun and found Clayton Baird behind her, his face twisted with panic and fury as he hauled her toward the edge of the platform. "You've ruined everything," he hissed. "Years of planning, destroyed by a girl who wouldn't stay in her place." Lila met his eyes, steady and unafraid, and slipped her hand into her pocket. "My place," she said, bringing out Hattie Crow's pearl-handled derringer, "is right here, standing beside the man I love, fighting for what's right." The small weapon rested firm in her palm, warm and ready, as the truth finally cornered the men who had tried to bury it. Clayton Baird's eyes widened as the truth finally caught up with him. The spoiled heiress he had tried to frighten into obedience was gone, replaced by a woman standing firm and unflinching. "You won't shoot me," he said, though the words sounded more like a plea than a threat. "I won't have to," Lila Crow answered evenly. Behind him, Cole Rourke closed the distance without a sound, moving with the quiet precision of a man trained to survive battle. When he spoke, his voice carried the hard authority of someone who had once sent men into danger and brought them back alive. "Let her go, Clayton. Now." "The hired cowboy comes galloping in to save his lady," Clayton sneered, though his grip on Lila's wrist weakened. "I'm not here to save anyone," Cole said calmly. "She doesn't need saving. I'm here to make sure you understand the cost of your choices." The moment stretched. 10 seconds balanced between bloodshed and surrender. Then Clayton released Lila and stepped back, his hands rising slowly. "This isn't finished," he muttered. But the fight had already drained out of him. "Yes, it is," Judge Elias Holt declared from the center of the platform, lifting the surviving copies of the evidence high for all to see. "These documents prove coordinated fraud involving territorial officials, railroad agents, and corrupt businessmen. Arrest warrants will be issued within the hour. The crowd erupted, not into chaos, but into controlled triumph. Guided by Cole's steady commands, citizens formed protective rings around the platform, ensuring the evidence remained secure. Sheriff Reed Walker and his deputies moved swiftly, placing the conspirators under arrest as ranchers and miners began reclaiming what had been stolen from them. When the noise finally settled, Lila stood beside Cole at the heart of a victory neither of them had been sure they would live to see. Justice had won, not through privilege, but through preparation, courage, and the refusal of ordinary people to stay silent. "It's over," Lila said softly, still scarcely believing it. "The court fight is," Cole replied, wrapping his arms around her, grounding her with his warmth. "But the real work starts now." He gestured to the crowd, neighbors already planning, rebuilding, restoring what corruption had nearly destroyed. "We've got a homestead to finish," he said, "a life to build, a future that finally belongs to us." As they walked together through the celebrating people, Lila felt the quiet certainty that had guided her from the very beginning. Crossing that dusty fairground months ago had changed everything. Cole had promised her a life she could feel in her bones, and he had given her exactly that. Partnership, respect, and shared resolve. The men who tried to steal their future now faced prison. Ahead of them lay marriage, children, and a ranch built by honest hands. In her pocket, Hattie Crow's derringer rested warm against her palm, a reminder of who she had become. But stronger still was what she carried inside. The unshakable knowledge that she stood exactly where she belonged, beside a man who saw her fully and loved her all the same. 6 months later, an April dawn bathed the Montana Territory in gold, marking the final turn in Lila's journey from sheltered heiress to equal partner in a working ranch. She stood in the doorway of the rebuilt barn, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly, watching Cole work the land they had reclaimed using compensation won in the trials. Where neglect once ruled, life now flourished. A homestead reborn, standing as proof that love and justice could outlast even the strongest corruption. The barn rose broader and stronger than the one that had burned, framed with timber paid for honestly, set by hands that refused shortcuts. The house had grown too, a new room added for a nursery where their first child would soon sleep. Yet the truest change stood in Lila Crow herself. The silk gowns and stiff manners were gone. She wore work clothes now, sleeves rolled, palms roughened by real labor. Her auburn hair stayed braided tight, practical and out of the way. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to the work and the land beneath her boots. "The mare's restless," Cole Rourke said, coming up beside her with that quiet smile that still set her heart to racing, even months into their marriage. "I reckon we'll have a foal before nightfall." "Just like our own," Lila answered, taking his hand and feeling the steady warmth that had only deepened through shared trials. "Doc says a few more weeks." They walked toward the house, passing the garden where Rosa Vale tended rows of green with the calm joy of someone finally free to nurture life instead of appearances. She had chosen the homestead without hesitation, insisting the next generation needed to learn the skills their parents were still mastering. Inside, Warren Crow sat at the kitchen table, ledgers spread wide. His change ran nearly as deep as his daughter's. The man who once measured success by influence and profit now found satisfaction in building something honest with his family. "The claims are producing better than we planned," he said, tapping the page. "New equipment should arrive by summer." The trials had ended with prison sentences for Clayton Baird, Silas Kern, and a dozen others tied to the fraud. More than punishment, the verdicts brought reform. Protections that shielded landowners across the territory. The Crow name, once a marker of wealth, now meant integrity. "I made something for you," Cole said softly, setting a wooden cradle on the table. He had spent evenings in the workshop, shaping each joint with care. The finish gleamed, the carving precise, vines and flowers intertwined, growth bound to growth. Lila traced the pattern, recognizing the promise carved into the wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Our child will sleep surrounded by the love that made it, and you've slept surrounded by the love that carried us through," Cole said, laying his hand over hers. The cradle was more than furniture. It was proof. The life she had dared to ask for at the county fair had been built plank by plank. The strong children she once imagined would come, yes, but they would be raised on respect, not convenience, on truth, not fear. That evening, as the mare delivered a healthy foal in the barn they rebuilt together, Lila understood what Maeve Crow's letters had meant all along. Security was not comfort handed down. It was love given freely, and partnership strong enough to meet whatever came. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked, watching the foal wobble to its feet. "Leaving the life you were born to for this uncertainty?" Lila smiled. The answer already settled in her bones. She took a long moment before answering, weighing the silk gowns she no longer wore, the polished gatherings she no longer endured, the safe predictability she had set aside in exchange for work that left her hands sore and her spirit whole. "I don't regret a single thing," she said at last. "I once asked you for strong sons. What you gave me was far greater. The chance to become strong enough to be their mother." The foal steadied itself and took its first unsure steps, legs trembling but determined. The sight felt like a quiet blessing. Their future, like that young life, might wobble at times, but it belonged entirely to them. As they walked back toward the house beneath a sky thick with stars, Lila felt the baby stir inside her and smiled, knowing the circle was beginning again. Soon there would be another crow to teach the difference between inheriting a life and building one, between accepting what the world handed down and choosing something better with open eyes. The wooden spoon she had carved months earlier still rested in its place of honor in the kitchen. A reminder that her hands could shape beauty meant to be used. Hattie Crow's derringer remained in its box, no longer needed, but kept close as proof that some things were worth defending. And somewhere in Warren Crow's study, Maeve Crow's wedding ring waited, ready to be passed down to a daughter who finally understood what it meant to choose love over convention. What had begun as a desperate escape from expectations had become living proof that two people, bound by shared values and complementary strengths, could build something that endured. The man who promised her a life she could feel in her bones had delivered it. A partnership so complete she could no longer imagine standing alone. In the distance, the lights of Larkspur Junction shimmered like fallen stars, a reminder that they belonged to a wider community, one that had learned the difference between leaders who served themselves and those who fought for justice. The territory was better for their courage, just as they were better for having found each other. As they settled into the home they had built together, surrounded by the marks of shared labor and quiet victories, Lila thought of the path that had led them here. It had started with a desperate woman crossing a dusty fairground to speak the truest words she knew to a stranger. It continued with that stranger's promise to give her more than she dared ask for, and it would carry on for decades. Through children raised to believe that real strength grows from integrity, that true security is born of love, and that the finest legacy anyone can leave is the courage to build something better than what they inherited. The baby's gentle kick against her ribs felt like a vow of continuation, of hope, and of endless possibility born when two people commit themselves fully to a future worthy of their love.